Now we have with us, and this is something I've been looking forward to for a long time, a good friend of mine and someone I highly respect. His name is Dr. Paul Williams. He's a journalist and the author of Operation Gladio. And if you haven't gotten that book, you got to read the book. In fact, he was on Coast to Coast talking about that. You can find that on YouTube. But in fact, in addition to Operation Gladio, he's also the author of the Vatican Exposed, Crescent Moon Rising, The Day of Islam, Osama's Revenge, and Al Qaeda Connection, and more, many other books. He's the winner of 3 first place Keystone Press Awards for journalism. He's written articles for major news outlets, including the USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, and National Review. He's also served as a consultant for the FBI, editor and publisher of the Metro, and that's in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and an adjunct professor of humanities at the University of Scranton. He's a smart guy, let me tell you. And he, having met him, and I don't want to overstate saying that I worked with him, but worked in conjunction with him. I got to know him, and his integrity is unmatched. But I'll say this: here's the book we're going to be talking about tonight. The subject is Among the Ruins and the decline and fall, of the Roman Catholic Church. This I read it this weekend. I picked it up thinking, oh, I'll just get a chapter here and then put it down and such. And first thing I knew, I was like a third of the way through it, and it was like 4 hours later, and then I'm reading and I'm getting angry and I'm hurt and I'm angry and I'm hurt and I'm angry and I'm hurt. You get the cycle, right? But one thing I want to tell him is this. I forgot this from my seminary days, and him and I grew up in a sense. We share a lot in common. Let me just say, if you've ever gone to a Latin Mass, if you've ever served, if you were an altar boy at a Latin Mass, the bells, or just a regular Mass, the incense, the bells. I was gonna say a phrase to him in Latin. Ego te absolvo, Mr. Williams, but from your book. Welcome aboard, sir.
It's great to see you. Can you see me?
We can see you. We can see right through you, actually.
Yeah, that's a frightful sight, Doug. It's good to be with you again, my friend.
Well, it's
and
great.
We worked very closely up in Canada.
I'll tell you something. You're an incredible author. You're an incredible writer, journalist, and the book opened my eyes to a lot of things. And all in one place, seemingly the history of the Catholic Church. And I know that you got some people saying, well, man, this is indeed calls for a rebuttal or response or whatever. I'm not sure exactly what that means, except to say that your work certainly has caused some ripples throughout the world. Now, I know this is a trite question, and John and I were talking about this, and I know John asked you this. Where do we even start with this? Because it's so huge.
Do you know where we can begin, Doug? We should begin by, people think Paul Williams writing a book on the Catholic Church had to be some Baptist who's engaged in Catholic bashing. And truth of the matter is, I'm Irish. I'm 80% Irish. I came from a background of Irish Catholic miners. I was I went through Catholic schools, taught at Catholic schools, worked for the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars. I am really a Catholic through and through, and I wrote the book because of the situation in the church right now, which is very disconcerting, and the fact that the church, that you got to realize 10%, Doug, of the Catholic Church. Now this is Pew Research. 10% of the Catholic priests have been accused of pedophilia. 10%. I mean, that number is astonishing. 60% of the Catholic clergy right now in America are practicing homosexuals. When I came upon these are facts you can't even dispute. Within the Curia in Rome, in the Vatican, there's a gay lobby. And that lobby, according to reports, came to include Pope Paul VI and Benedict XVI. Now, when I came upon all this, I figured, man, like this stuff is knockout material. Then I came upon like the situation with the Duplessis orphans in Quebec, where the Catholic Church had thousands and thousands of kids in orphanages, very uh, just kids who were born mostly of what they call unwed mothers at that time, and they took the kids in and they classified the kids as being mentally deficient in order to receive more government funds. And there was nothing wrong. These kids were psychologically tested. There was nothing the matter with them at all. They were subjected to like the worst type of chemical and biological experiments, lobotomies, and it was all for the sake of money. And I was coming upon one scandal after, what, let me just continue. Right now in Catholic churches throughout the country, and the average parish loses over $1,000 a week in theft, and the thieves are the priest.
You mean
I
skimming?
don't know no, skimming, yeah. I don't know even where to stop with this. But in any case, I think this is interesting. When I finished writing the book, it got very good reviews, by the way. And I've been bashed in my time, but this, like Publishers Weekly said, it's a must-read. Kirkus Review. I was getting like these stellar reviews. But what happened was the book came out on August the 15th, and usually I do hundreds of interviews. Um, I mean, literally. Well, I mean, you've been in radio so long. I mean, people just, they need guests, even guests like me, to fill their time. But this is what was interesting. After that book came out what's glowing reviews and information that would really make your hair stand on end, the only person who has interviewed me is you. No, I think that if there's any book that I have written that has been iced, it's this one.
I
Uh,
believe that.
yeah, I think what's happening is people are afraid to have me on because they think that if I'm a guest, I will frost the Catholic viewers. I think they think that if I'm a guest, they will offend the Catholic Church, Catholic sponsors. I've never encountered anything like this. And once again, the fact right now of what's happening with Catholicism in the country and throughout the world is of monumental importance to everyone. Uh, the Catholic Church right now, which was once the strongest religious and political institution in the country, is now losing over 400,000 members every year off the books. These are people who call up and say, "I want out. I've had it with the pedophilia. I've had it with the scandals. I've had it with the church. I've had it with Pope Francis. I'm out." 400,000 call up and remove themselves from the Catholic rolls in the United States. I mean, that's alarming. For every four Catholics that drop out, there's only one convert or one new Catholic being baptized. So what you're seeing right now in our day and age is the demise of a major religious body, and nobody's discussing it. And at the same time, Doug, that this is going on, it's something that you know better than anyone in the country. Islam is growing by leaps and bounds. It's the number one religion in the world. In the United States, there are more Muslims than Jews. I mean, this is a real significant development in this country. You have places like Brooklyn, New York, that used to be Irish settlements that are now totally Islamic. You have places like Lodi, California, Dearborn, Michigan. I could go on and on and on. But it's actual cities are being transformed into Islamic cities. And once again, that's a story what's happening in the United States right now religiously, I think should be of concern to everybody in the country.
No, I agree with you 100% on that. And in the book walks us through. First of all, it lays out your belief, your foundation, which I think is pretty clear, and I want to thank you for that. And then you walk us through really a lengthy period throughout the Vatican and papacy, and you go into different areas. I mean, you address everything from free, Masonic influence to my goodness to the pornography and the pedophilia in the Vatican, but you don't exploit you don't exploit this. I don't think you do. I mean, it's an investigative analysis of what's gone through in the Vatican or what the Vatican has done. And one of the things Joe you mentioned about the American exceptionalism being heretical in nature was rather interesting as well. But you do touch on the various factors that cause the church to that have caused the church to suffer cataclysmic changes and losses in all aspects of its existence,
Well,
which I thought was interesting.
in the day, Doug, as you recall, the Catholic Church said it was the only ark of salvation. This is what I was taught,
Hmm.
that if you wanted to be saved, this was like in the days of Noah, you had to become a Catholic.
Right.
And outside the church, this is from St. Cyprian, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas. Outside the church, there was no salvation. Uh, uh, Out of this recently, what from that stance where you had to be a Catholic to be saved. I mean, there were exceptions that they would believe that somebody who was a Protestant, raised a Protestant, now get this, could be saved, but only if they underwent a baptism by heart in the Catholic Church. Only if they were exposed to Catholic doctrine and consented to the fact that it was true. And if they did that, then there's a possibility they could be saved. Outside of that, no. Now, we went from that position in the Catholic Church uh, to a position right now where John Paul II conducted an interreligious ceremony in Madrid. And at the ceremony, he had Hindu priests, he had imams, he had rabbis, he had people from every denomination, the Zoroastrians, and he said that this is the Catholic Church now, that we're all worshiping the same God. And in the midst, you can see this on video, this ceremony. In the midst of the ceremony, a voodoo priest took center stage and started rattling bones at the people in the congregation. And once again, the Pope saying, "Oh, we're all worship." I'm sorry, I really do not worship the same God as that voodoo person rattling bones at the congregation. I don't worship the same God as the Muslims. And for the Pope to say that and to bow down and kiss the Quran, if that doesn't outrage Catholics, I don't know what can. Another thing, and I can run on just
Well,
discuss.
go ahead because we've come a long way from the days of the flying nun on television, and
Ah,
that was one of the things that struck me today thinking about this. So, you just go ahead and converse through this because you know this best, and I don't want to take you off track. So go ahead.
you got to realize the days of the Flying Nun when Sally Fields played the Flying Nun, there were 500,000 religious sisters in the United States. Now they have 35,000. I mean, an entire vocation, religious vocation, has been wiped out. Uh, the nuns who are nuns right now are demanding to be ordained. They're demanding more rights. They do not live in the cloister. They do not dress in the habits, despite the fact that that's contrary to natural law. The church says one thing officially, and what really takes place is something radically different. Uh, even in terms of women distributing communion, but by canon law, that's a no-no. You can't do that. I mean, that's absolutely no, unless times of extraordinary circumstances, like for instance, if there's a plane crash and the only people who are mobile are women, and there's a chalice there, then yeah, they can distribute that communion if the priest is dead. But other than that, but in every Catholic church in the country right now, you'll find very few people in attendance, and yet in every mass you'll find 4 or 5 women up front distributing communion, and they're distributing just like you would distribute a Necco wafer to a kid in the park. I mean, with absolutely no reverence or anything else that goes in your hand. And in the old days, the only one who could touch the communion was the priest, and the thumb and the index finger was consecrated. When a priest was ordained, they wrapped linen around these fingers, and they soaked it with holy oil, chrism, and they sanctified these fingers solely to touch the Eucharist. And as a matter of fact, if a priest was missing a thumb or this index finger, he could not be consecrated. If the communion was so sacred that it had to be placed on your tongue, it couldn't be touched by anybody. If it dropped on the ground, it was a catastrophe, because every piece, every crumb of that communion was a communion in itself. And therefore, during the Mass, you had the priest constantly using like the Swiss broom to clean the patens and to clean out the chalice, pouring wine in the chalice to make sure there were no crumbs left. Because the main fear throughout the Middle Ages and until recently was that a mouse might eat, or a fly could take a speck, and a fly would be consuming the body and blood of Jesus. So, I mean, all of that reverence, all of that stress on transubstantiation, on the Eucharist, all that is eradicated. It's amazing. It's for me, growing up through that tradition, and to see, if you go to Mass right now, everybody goes to communion. Everybody. When I was a young man, you never ever went to communion without going to confession. And after you went to confession, which was on Saturday, that Saturday night after midnight, you couldn't eat, you couldn't drink, you had to fast
I
until you
remember those
received.
days. Yeah.
Remember that?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
You had to be in a state of sanctifying grace. Well, suddenly everybody in America is in a state of sanctifying grace because they all receive communion, and nobody, less than 8% of the Catholics in America ever go to confession, or the sacrament of reconciliation, as it's called right now. So once again, I thought that what I was revealing would be of great interest to the American people, because it's the demise of, once again, the most powerful religious institution in the world. Now, you got to stop me from running on, because I could talk and talk and talk on this.
No, we invited you to come on to talk about this, but go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, there's so many areas where we can go from here. I mean, there's a list of heresies that have been invented by the Catholic Church that are completely opposite even the foundational teachings of Jesus and the Bible.
Uh-huh.
And, it seems like as time has gone on from 300 AD, all through even the 1800s, we see this list getting longer and longer and longer. And rather than change back to a more foundational biblical way of the teaching, it seems that they continue to double down. Now we have a pope with Pope Francis.
Well, wait a second, because
Okay.
in this, what Paul does, he takes issue with Popes Paul VI and John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and then Francis. And as you pointed
Pope
out,
Pius VI.
Steering the church far away from its traditional teachings, as Joe said, and for a lack of oversight that allowed corruption. And for a lack of oversight that allowed corruption to fester. And I think that's kind of the area that, with the bank, with the Masonic influence.
Oh, yeah.
So all of that is
Well,
kind of where we want to go ahead.
Let's talk about one of the first things that you get into in your book is usury and the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Can we get into that a little
Sure.
bit, and how? Go ahead.
Sure. Throughout from the time the church was founded, usury, which is making money from interest, was a sin that was so grave, in many instances, it could only be forgiven by a bishop. No Catholic could engage in lending money for interest. If you did that, your penance, and there were penitential codes that were developed through the Middle Ages, your penance would be go for months of making pilgrimages so that you could be forgiven for that sin. Well, because the church could not make money from interest, after the Reformation, when the banking and the mercantile caste came to the forefront and capitalism was born, the church couldn't invest in the new technology and innovations, couldn't invest in anything where they could make money from money, because once again, that was a cardinal sin. And as early as 1926, it was still. I mean, they were decrying it. Uh, there wasn't one Catholic bank that that charged interest on a loan. It was kind of like an Islamic bank. But what happened in 1927? The church was at that time a very poor institution, since they couldn't engage in making money from interest. The church existed uh, in the days of Pope Pius XI. I'm going back to 1927. Uh, the church's total budget for running the church international was less than $1 million. The uh, Many of the apostolic palaces in the Vatican City were in the state of shambles, and the church did not have money. Well, what happened is Mussolini wanted to have the entire government consent to his fascist government, to his fascist system of government, or in a referendum. And to do that, they had to do away with the Christian Democratic Party in Italy. And the Pope agreed to that with the Lateran Treaty, that the church supported Mussolini. In exchange for Mussolini, the church received almost $100 million in cash and tax-exempt status throughout Italy and many, many more benefits. Well, what happened was...
Yeah, I just want to punch in here real quick and then let you continue. I thought this was perhaps one of the most enlightening parts of the book. I never knew this about the Mussolini Vatican connection specific, that the way you've written it. So go ahead, sir.
Yeah, it's really kind of interesting that because they got the money from Mussolini, and anyone can research this for themselves, everything changed. The church turned to Pope Pius XI, turned to a guy by the name of Nogara, and he was a whiz in terms of investments, and he invested the church's money in American corporations, in European corporations, in pharmaceuticals, in communications, and in munitions. Uh, so that the church suddenly was a major stockholder, and it was making money from interest. And then Catholic banks came into existence. In 1942, the Catholic Vatican Bank was established under Pope Pius XII. And once again, this is totally contrary to a Catholic tradition. And it was the first major break in tradition going back 2,000 years. You had suddenly this position where you could not make a dime in interest to creating a bank. And with the creation of that bank, that's a source of all evil. St. Paul was right, because due to the bank, the church became obsessed with its riches, with its holdings. It gradually became the richest institution on planet Earth. It engaged in many criminal activities, including setting up shell companies in Panama to launder drug money, including setting up the Vatican as the major laundry for the heroin trade, for the money coming in from the mafia and the CIA. And you had all of that going on, and that corruption became endemic. But it came from, as Joe pointed out, it came from usury. Once they did away with the sin of usury, then more things became possible and permissible. But that was the beginning.
Yeah, and that's amazing to read about when and I didn't get a chance to read the whole book. I'm gonna hopefully be able to finish it this week. But
let me tell you one thing. Let me interrupt you one second. I'm sorry, but people should understand this. The Vatican Bank was set up by Nogara and by Pope Pius XII as a separate entity within a sovereign nation. Vatican City is not part of Italy. The Vatican City is a sovereign, separate nation.
Is that the incorporated?
Yes,
okay.
It's totally separate. They run their own government. They have their own militia. They have their own police. It's totally different from, it's not part of Italy. Most people assume it is. No, it isn't. The Pope is the supreme ruler of Vatican City. Within Vatican City, in 1942, they established the Institution for Religious Works, IOR, which is the Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank is a sovereign institution within a sovereign state, which means that it cannot be audited by any outside agency. You can't come in from Interpol. You can't come in from any outside banking agency like Morgan Stanley or and open the books of the no. They're completely closed. When the Vatican discloses its finances, it will say, "Well, we're running $50 million, $500 million in the red," and they'll disclose other financial figures. They'll tell you everything about the various dioceses, the expenditures, but they won't tell you one thing about the Vatican Bank. That's totally separate. And in all their financial statements, there's a clause that says the financial statements of the church are do not include or exempt from the separate holdings of the Vatican Bank. How much is in the Vatican Bank has always been a matter of conjecture, but the church will plead poverty. They'll say that they're destitute, they need to raise funds for the bishop's annual appeal, but they will never tell you how much money is in the Vatican Bank. And thanks to Nagara and people like Michele Sandana, who was a mafioso who was in charge of the Vatican Bank, they made an awful lot of money. And not only through munitions, I mean, selling arms during World War II and still selling arms, but also through pharmaceuticals. The Catholic Church right now is invested in companies like Sereno that produce birth control pills, completely contrary to Catholic doctrine, completely contrary. Laboratories that are engaged in stem cell research. The Catholic Church is heavily invested, but you won't find that out. But it's all, once again, all of this money is contained in the Vatican Bank, which is a total separate entity. So when people talk to you about the holdings of the Catholic Church or Catholic finances, you got to realize that
when you wrote about the year of three popes, was it your contention that the Vatican Bank, that among the reasons perhaps that we had just a 30-day reign of one pope was because of the findings, his findings with respect to the Vatican Bank, among other things, or was it something different?
Oh, what happened with John Paul I, Luciani, was he was Doug. He was not by nature the brightest of popes or the smartest of popes. He was kind of kind of almost like a comical figure. His favorite character, if you met him, and the people that I knew who knew him very well, he used to talk all the time about Pinocchio and cartoons and stuff like that. He was not a heavyweight. But what happened was when he after he became the Pope, after he became the Holy Father, a cardinal by the name of Benelli got him aside and said, "Look at the Vatican Bank right now is engaged in all these illegal activities. The Vatican Bank has been involved in selling over $1 billion in counterfeit securities. They were investigated by the FBI, and Nixon made them drop the findings because they discovered that they were up to their eyeballs in that, selling fake securities, $1 billion. And the securities were prepared by members of the Gambino family in New York. That's just one thing. Another thing is the Vatican Bank set up all these shell companies in Panama, where drug dealers like Pablo Escobar would take suitcases full of cash, millions, hundreds of millions and millions of dollars, take them into these shell companies, and the money would go from there to the Vatican, to accounts in Liechtenstein and Switzerland, and then back to Escobar and company. So Bellini told Pope John Paul I, he set him down, and he said, "You've got to get rid of Parmos who is the head of the Vatican Bank. You got to get rid of all the Masonic Masons that are meeting secretly to do nefarious acts. And once again, this was coming out in the Italian press. You got to get rid of them. You got to have an audit of the Vatican Bank once and for all. And you have to end all this criminal activity. Okay. Bellini gave him this information on his 32nd day of his pontificate. When he went to bed that night, and he had no health problems at all. At 5 o'clock in the morning, he was dead. There were signs that he had been poisoned. The Vatican account of his condition was radically different from his actual condition, as found by coroners and morticians later. When he was in bed, he was covered with vomit. His eyes were bulging from the socket, and there were all signs that he had been poisoned. Immediately, when his body was found, 2 undertakers were called, and popes are not supposed to, by canon law, must not be embalmed. Well, they embalmed Pope John Paul in his bed before they removed the body. They didn't remove his blood. Now think about this. They didn't even remove his blood. And the members of the hierarchy, who should have been fast asleep at that time at 5 o'clock in the morning, were all wandering around the Vatican Square in full regalia. I mean, there's suspicion after suspicion after suspicion. The nun who found his body, Sister Vincentia, was immediately whisked away to a nunnery, and guess what? Never found again. Never found again. Nobody ever interrogated her or could, and nobody knows what happened to her. So the circumstances surrounding his death are, to this day, very mysterious. But once again, you're dealing with a sovereign nation and a sovereign ruler within that sovereign nation, and you're not going to be able to bring in outside agencies to really do the spade work. HAGMANN and HAGMANN would not be welcome there. And I think if I had Doug HAGMANN, and you're the best investigator I know, Doug. I don't know Joe like I know you, but you're the best. But I know if they brought Doug HAGMANN into the papal apartment that morning, I'll bet truth would be told, and I think you would find one outrage after the other. So yeah, I definitely think he was killed.
Yeah, and I have to say this: you approached all of these subjects with integrity and with again measured analysis. So I can't see where you would have any problem anywhere with respect to the contents of this book. But then again, you are dealing with a subject, CIA infiltration, Mossad infiltration, or not Mossad, Masonic infiltration, and the corruption really from way back when through today, and then the covering up of the conspiracy, and then the cover up of the crimes, the cover up and such. So you've dealt with all of these. Now we've got we got some time here left of this hour.
Can I talk to you about one other thing?
Yeah, please.
That I would be interested in. One of the main changes in the church concern natural law. People aren't really aware of this, but Doug, I'm an old man. I'm 73, and I went through. I was a Tridentine Catholic, and raised in the Latin Mass and everything else. But what we were taught at that time was there was something called natural law, which governed all of creation, and it governed primarily sexual behavior. What that meant, and this went all the way back to the Bible. It's mentioned in Paul's letter to the Romans, natural law. It was expounded by Augustine and by Aquinas. What it meant is males naturally are different than females. Male has a sex organ that's external and it protrudes. I don't want to get too graphic. Yeah, I will get graphic. What the heck? And women have a genitalia that's internal, and it goes in. Well, what the Catholic Church said was the part that protrudes is supposed to go with the part that uh, goes within. The two parts are meshed. That's why they were created. That's why you had a penis, and that's why you had a vagina. They were separate, but they were meant to combine for the creation of a baby. And that act for procreation was sacred. And therefore, this is what the church taught. The only natural sexual behavior was sexual intercourse. You can see why. You can't have a penis in an anus. You can't have a penis in an oral orifice, or a penis in an ear, or a penis in or anything else. A penis in a penis, because that's unnatural. The only permissible and sanctified behavior, and within marriage now, outside of marriage, you can't do this at all. But within marriage, and it's only for procreation, is sexual intercourse. Therefore, this is what we were taught as Catholics, and this is Catholic doctrine going all the way back 2,000 years. One of the worst sins, Joe will get a kick out of this. One of the worst sins in the church at that time, a mortal sin. If you died with this sin still on your soul, you would go right to hell. Was masturbation, spilling your seed and letting it go on the ground. Mortal sin. A sin that was so grave that this is in my diocese of Scranton, Pennsylvania. The sin of homosexuality was so grave that if you went to confession to your parish priest, he couldn't forgive it. It could only be forgiven by the bishop. This entire concept of natural law, you can see if you buy into it, even going back to Aristotle, makes perfect sense. I mean, biologically, it makes sense, because I don't think you can dispute the fact that, if there's a natural reason for the male genitalia and the female genitalia, it's procreation. And that can only be achieved in one manner. But what happened after Vatican II is all this was lost. All this was lost. These teachings were discarded entirely. So that when you had a condemnation of something, of a sexual act like homosexuality, it didn't make any sense. There was no philosophical basis for the prohibition. There was no theological reason why that should be prohibited. There was no reason why you shouldn't be able to do anything sexually that you wanted to do. So, I mean, that happened. And right now, throughout in Catholic colleges, in Catholic seminaries, that whole concept of natural law has been discarded. And this was integral to Catholic theology. You cannot understand Catholicism without understanding natural law. I'll tell you how deeply it goes. The perfect state, according to the church, was the state of Jesus Christ, who was never married. And according to the Catholic Church, never engaged in sexual activity. So therefore, they upheld this idea of clerical celibacy. So just say you were married, and the perfect state then would be to live under the Pauline privilege, to treat your wife as a sister. This is Catholic theology. It sounds so crazy now, but this is what we were taught. And once again, the worst thing you could do, and I mean, believe me, I went to confession, and I am not an angel. But one of the worst things you could do is engage in any of these activities. If you were having sex with your girlfriend, you might as well fornicate. Because if you did anything else other than that, your penance would be extremely stiff. But, once again,
unless your name is Father Land, which you wrote about, and the penance is just 5 Hail Marys and reassignment, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And right now, let me take this a step further. In Catholic seminaries throughout the country, Catholic seminary in St. Mary's in Baltimore, Catholic seminary in Chicago, there are hotbeds of homosexual activity. In some of these seminaries, 85% of them are practicing gays. So the seminarians who go in there and who are somewhat devout are horrified. And in Baltimore, for instance, every weekend, the seminarians, that's training for the priesthood, are transported by bus to the block where they go to the gay bars, they go to the bathhouses, they go wherever they want to go, and then they get back in the bus and proceed with their lifestyle. But once again, knowing what the church taught and knowing these situations right now in the seminary and the fact that so many priests are right. Well, you see, the priests, like I told you in the beginning, 60% of them are practicing homosexuals. I mean, that's alarming, uh, especially in light of the Catholic tradition.
Yeah, that's amazing. The fact that what really gets me, and I know this is what we're talking about here, is the fact that these changes can be made one after the other, that go against the Ten Commandments, that go against the teaching of Jesus, and yet we don't see pushback from the congregation of Catholics. I mean, you might see some here and there, a few here in this church, a few there in this church, but we have not seen a massive revolution of Catholics saying, this is enough. And maybe that goes to the point, something that I know I'd like to spend a little bit of time on, is papal infallibility, and that many Catholics believe the Pope is infallible. So the decisions that the Pope makes in order to change doctrine in the Bible is looked upon as okay because he is God on earth, according to the Catholic Church. And that's so twisted and antithetical to Scripture in every way possible. I just don't understand how it is not seen for what it is and called out by Catholics themselves.
Well, you got to realize that Catholicism right now, what people have done is uh, they've staged a quiet rebellion, I would say, against the church. In 1965, when Vatican II came to a close, 78% of the Catholics, now this 78% of the Catholics attended Mass every week. Now the other 22% might have been infirm, they might have been, on a battlefield, who knows? But they probably had some darn good reason not to be at Mass. But churches were filled to the overflowing. Catholics went week after week after week. Do you know right now, among the Catholics in America, only 24% of the Catholics go to Mass at all? At all. They don't even make their 24%. That's it. Most of them never darken the doorway of a church. They have nothing to do with it. So, the church made all these changes. They amassed a lot of money, but they sacrificed their soul to get where they are.
Yeah, indeed. And one of the things, and this is to me, Paul, this is a difficult subject for me to talk about too, because the enormity of it all, and the effect, and how you encapsulated, how you did this. I don't know how. I mean, I just don't know, but how you have really taken the subject and made it digestible in segments, and then kind of your analysis over everything. It's just remarkable. But, and again, among the ruins, the decline and fall of the Roman Catholic Church is the title and subtitle of this book, available on Amazon. I highly recommend it for a study and for those people very serious about looking at the Catholic Church. But just the entirety of what would you call it? I mean, you and I, we're similar. I mean, you served at Mass, I'm sure, right? You did.
Of course. Intro I bought at Atari Day. Of course, I studied Latin. I'm a Latinist in college.
Yeah, right. And of course, you and I both. I mean, look, I graduated from a minor seminary, and I went through the process of all of the Catholic rites. That's how I was raised. Okay, just to be clear to people, that's how I was raised. Because some people are going to call me some Jesuit assassin or something, but it's ridiculous. But But
Yeah.
but that's and we've seen this institution taken, as you've documented, taken and just um wow. How we only have like 40 seconds into, we're 40 seconds away from the break. So, but this institution just sullied so much by the touch of man, and how you encapsulated that is I'll never know. But we got more on the other side. We'll get more specific on the other side. Our guest is Dr. Paul L. Williams, a good friend of the show, good friend of mine, just a prolific author, many books, including his latest, Among the Ruins. You've got to really. That's an eye opener.
As well as Crescent Moon Rising, The Day of Islam, and Operation Gladio, which
not a bad book in the bunch, let me tell you. And Operation
No.
Gladio was really,
that's a big one.
yeah. Folks, we'll be right back with Dr. Paul L. Williams, again, a good friend of the show and a good friend of just a prolific writer and tremendous man. Stay right where you're at. You know, Paul Williams is our guest, and Kevin Shipp we had on Friday on the dust jacket of Paul Williams' book, Among the Ruins, is Kevin Shipp wrote a masterfully written and documented expose, and that's true. This is an account every American and every Catholic must read if they believe in the importance of true faith and holding the leaders of the Catholic Church, the U.S. government, and the CIA for horrific crimes against humanity. Okay, so think about that for a second, the enormity of that statement. This is a tremendous book. I would think that any Catholic, any person of faith would want to read about the Catholic Church and the goings on within the Catholic Church and the effect it's had through the present. And Paul Williams is here to discuss just that. Paul Williams is one of the most prolific and best authors I know. He said he was 73 years old. I don't believe that, because he could outrun me. He could whoop me. I'll tell you that. Before we get to Paul, I want to just mention that. I want to ask, well, whether you're a guy or you're a lady, have you surprised that special someone lately? And I have just a treat for you. As a matter of fact, I sent my wife flowers from proflowers.com, and for no reason at all. And I put on the card just because, and she got it, and she got the bouquet. It was actually of farm stand flowers, and she got the bouquet, and she was just blown away. And she said, "Why'd you do this?" And I was a hero for like a day and a half, 2 days, a week actually, because she'd walk by, and it was just the aroma from the flowers, the beautiful scent from the flowers. It just wafted through the family room. It was gorgeous. And so her reaction and my being proud of it, I'll tell you what, it was just a great thing. So really, folks, take a moment out and surprise that special someone with the gift of flowers, because predictability is boring, surprises are exciting, and ProFlowers makes it easy for you to surprise someone right now. And they're even making it easier with a very special offer for you, the listeners of this program. Send ProFlowers, in fact, farm stand flowers, or they've got a number of different specials. If you go to proflowers.com and then in the search bar, put Hagmann in the search bar, and up will come an entire array of flower arrangements. And man, you could spend all day shopping there. ProFlowers makes proflowers.com. It makes choosing the perfect surprise bouquet simple and quick. They're guaranteed to stay fresh for at least 7 days or your money back. You pick the exact date of your unexpected surprise will arrive, and they give you more bloom for your buck. It's big, beautiful flowers with more stems for your money. If you want to get 20% off of purchases over $29.99 or $29 or more, go to proflowers.com and use my code word Hagmann at checkout. That's proflowers.com, code Hagmann. Put Hagmann in the search bar, and also at the checkout, use Hagmann for the promo code. Don't wait to make someone's day. Just go ahead and be unpredictable and do that today. And put a smile on someone's face. And the flowers, they're just gorgeous. So 2 dozen long stem rainbow roses, 2 dozen long stem rainbow roses is my recommendation, but don't tell anyone. No, tell everyone. It's good stuff.
We are talking with author Paul Williams. His book, Among the Ruins, is our topic of discussion. And this is a fantastic book And again, I have not read through all of it, but what I have read through is very, very interesting. And Paul, this hour, let's start from the present. Pope Francis. We saw a very interesting transition with the retirement of Pope Benedict. And if I remember correctly, that's the first time in papal history that a pope retired.
Not the first time. I think
Not
it
the
was the
first time.
third.
Okay.
Yeah, other popes have retired,
Okay.
but he was the first one in modern history.
Okay. And
And
then he really is. He's the first the first American pope, the first Western pope. He's from South America, and he's been making a lot of changes, taking a lot of stances on everything from man-made climate change to homosexuality and a lot of things that are stirring up the Catholic controversies, if you will. What's your take on
uh,
Pope Francis?
well, first of all, Pope Francis has allowed Protestants to receive communion. I mean, which is, once again, I can't think of anything that would violate canon law more grievously than that. And yet he has done that. Uh, he has he has advocated uh, premarital sex in several of his statements. He has said publicly that he is not in a position to judge anyone or judge anything, and yet a pope is supposed to judge things that have already been judged by God. That's why he's in holy office. He has furthered this stance of religious indifferentism, where he believes that all forms of religious expression are equally efficacious. That Muslims are related to the body of Christ, and even non-believers are related by an extension to the body of Christ. And once again, this is completely contrary to Catholic doctrine. Bergoglio, or Francis himself, is a very interesting character. His real name is Jorge Maria Bergoglio. He's a Jesuit. He was the provincial general of the Society of Jesus in Buenos Aires during the time of the Dirty War. This is when Vidalia and these other people came to power, military junta, in 1978. And they started rounding up people who were politically opposed to them, and they made them disappear. Their main means of making people disappear in Buenos Aires was to load them on helicopters in bunches, like 24, 25 people on a helicopter, fly them over the ocean and push them off. And they killed hundreds of thousands that way. Bergoglio gave communion, and he was the confessor to Vidalia, General Vidalia, supported the junta. And then he encouraged the junta to go after a priest who he believed to be political dissidents, and members of congregations that were presided over by Jesuit priests, members of the congregation who were political opponents. He had them singled out, and many members of these congregations disappeared. They were rounded up by the junta, and they were gone. Priest, in Bergoglio's order, he turned over 2 priests to the junta, and they tortured them for months and months and months. And Bergoglio consented to that. He was a leading advocate, once again, of the dirty war there. Because of what he did in Buenos Aires, hundreds of thousands of people died. He was as bad in his own way as any prelate I think can imagine. And yet, by the way, in his native Buenos Aires, he's been charged with crimes against humanity.
Wow.
And that's people will say, oh no, 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 he he's just being accused of this, but he will not go back and face charges. And when he was interrogated, when was interrogated by the Buenos Aires officials, he like took the fifth through everything, would not say anything, and he is not like people think of. Look at him right now and they think, oh, this is a great humanitarian. He loves kids. He loves. No, no. This is a man who has committed atrocious acts against humanity. He has not only done that, but he has uh, uh, secularized the sacred. He has, I think, in his own way, done more to undermine Catholic doctrine than almost anybody in recent memory, except for John Paul II.
I knew he had a kind of a shady past. I did not know. This is the first time I've heard of what you called the dirty war,
Yeah.
and some of the tactics used there, and him being one of the main players in there. That's kind of frightening. Do you think that's why he was rewarded with the Pope, the papacy?
Well, the reason he was let me say a couple more things about Bergoglio in the Dirty War in Argentina at that time. What they would do is like the people who were disappeared, the parishioners, Catholics who were taken, they were taken up in the middle of the night. They would knock on your door and they would get Doug and his wife, and Joe, you wouldn't see them anymore. They'd be gone, and you'd have no idea what happened to them. And if there were a baby in the house, they would take the baby. And a lot of the babies, the church sold them to families who were looking to adopt kids, and it was a great source of income. And once again, you have to go back and look at Bergoglio's involvement in all this, and these sins of the past. I don't think he's ever publicly confessed them, so I don't think he's received absolution. And and yet, the press, just like what I'm saying about this book, the press is very reluctant to address these issues or to say anything negative against Bergoglio, because they think that if you do that, you're being anti-Catholic. He's the first Jesuit pope. He has once again made statements that should cause every believing Catholic to really cry out for his expulsion. His past, everything else. What can I say? Another thing about the church, this, like you said about the apathy of Catholics. When John Paul II died, there was a massive crowd, tens of thousands in St. Peter's Square. You probably remember this, Doug and Joe. You both probably remember this. So they were crying out, sainthood now, canonize him now. Well, he was canonized, John Paul II, without having going through the correct procedure. When you're up for canonization, somebody's supposed to present a counter position to the canonization, and that person is called a devil's advocate. Well, John Paul II did away with the devil's advocate. He did away with the stipulation that 2 verifiable miracles must be performed by the person canonized. He changed all these rules regarding canonization, and sure enough, he was canonized. Now let's look at the person that we canonized. Number one, he presided over the greatest financial scandal, the Ambrosiano affair, in the history of any church. An affair, the Ambrosiano affair, that took money from hundreds of thousands of poor Italian families and robbed the money, and it went to the coffers of the Vatican. John Paul II was guilty of turning a blind eye to the pedophilia scandal, which ravaged the church to such an extent that in the United States right now, federal prosecutors demand to prosecute Catholic clerics under RICO. This was because of John kept transferring priests from parish to parish, condoning that and condoning that. He condoned once again the dismantlement of Catholic sacramentology, of its ecclesiastical structure. He openly kissed the Quran. I don't think anybody, and you got to realize that the Catholic Church, part of the glory of the church was defending the world against Islam and against the Ottoman Turks in the 12th century. I mean, the Crusades were a defensive war, but he once again, I mean, all of this came under John Paul II, our newest saint. And if anyone was not a saint, I would say it would be John Paul II,
And
except for Bergoglio.
and I've got to say, and I'm going to toss it to Joe because he's got a question. I think a good one. For a man in the Vatican, a pope, to kiss the Quran. Oh my goodness! I mean,
Yeah.
and it's in the book too. I mean, folks, the step-by-step decline and fall, the documentation is incredible, and the resource. In fact, Dr. Williams, I'm going to be using this book, if you don't mind, for a series of articles I've been doing, or some research I've been doing. I mean, your research on this is just impeccable. I've got to say. But Joe, you had a question about John Paul.
I wanted to ask you. You talked about the loosening of some of the rules by John Paul. Did he do that for it to make it easier for himself and others to be canonized, or was there other reasons for him changing and loosening the rules?
That's a good question. What happened was during the reign of John Paul II, there was a shortage. Pedophilia broke out. You got to remember, Ambrosiano broke out. All these scandals broke out, and the contributions of the faithful, Peter's pence, the amount of the contributions that went to the Vatican, and that's known as Peter's pence, fell to a pittance because of him. So what he did was he started canonizing thousands of people who would have never been canonized. And he did that because the canonization process is very, very, very expensive. To become a saint costs anywhere between $250,000 to $500,000. I mean, just to advance your clause. So much money was going into the coffers for the advancement of the canonization of these people. And do you know what? This is also interesting. The money that came in, and for these clauses, they call them clause for canonization, it's all disappeared. All disappeared.
Wow.
Millions and millions and millions unaccounted for.
Well, it's when you talked about and explained basically the incorporation of the Vatican for the purposes of the Vatican Bank and whatnot, and you talked about this Robert Calvi, and I just started to do do a little bit of research on him, and it ties in. We were going to talk about the Masonic connection, and his death has a very interesting angle related to a Masonic connection and a group. Where is it here? It was known as, was it the Black Friars or the Brick Friars?
Yep. Black Friars.
Okay.
Black Friars Bridge. Roberto Calvi, 1982. Yeah, his feet were dangling right in the river, and he was hanged from Blackfriars Bridge, and he was the head of Banco Ambrosiano, but even more importantly, he was a Catholic Mason, and he was a part of a lodge called Propaganda Due, which involved the Catholic clerics, the Catholic hierarchy, the CIA, and the mafia in performing acts of terror throughout Italy during the so-called Years of Lead. And what happened was the Catholic Church wanted to keep the Christian Democratic Party in power, and they were afraid of the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, coming to power. So they would with through Masonic lodges. They met in Masonic lodges, and they would arrange for different acts of terror to be staged throughout Italy. Uh, the first one was the bombing of Piazza Fontana, and it went on and concluded with the bombing of the Bologna train station. Once again, thousands of people killed. So that, and these acts were always blamed on the Red Brigades and on the communists and on the PCI, so the Christian Democrats would stay in power. And that went on for it was called the Years of Lead, but it went on for good 12, 13 years. And the Catholic clerics, they gathered and they met with the CIA in these Masonic lodges because they could meet there in private with mafioso. When they decided that they were gathering there so often in, I guess, this propaganda due lodge, that they might as well become Masons. So they actually became a full degreed Freemasons in violation, once again, of canon law. And this was something else that John Paul I discovered the night before he was killed. They found a list of the Catholic cardinals and Catholic bishops who had become full-fledged Masons and were involved in staging these awful acts of terrorism throughout Italy and really throughout Europe, because the Munich massacre was planned by these people too. And once again, this is not conjecture. All this is very well documented. People just need to look up P2. You'll see.
Explain that, if you don't mind. P2, your reference to P2 and Freemasonry. Explain that for our listeners.
What happened was propaganda due, propaganda two. Propaganda, that means Masonic propaganda. Due to the second lodge devoted to it. Well, that lodge was really established, I think, in 1880 or 1885. I'm very close. It was a very popular lodge in right around Milan, and it was thriving. Well, what happened when Mussolini came to power, he outlawed all Masonic lodges. They were all shut down, including propaganda due. And after the fall of Mussolini and after the establishment of the Vatican Bank and money coming in from the mafia, and the church became entangled with the CIA, they had to meet someplace. And now Masonic lodges were legal. So this was a perfect place to meet because it was clandestine. Nobody would question, the secrecy involving it. The names of the members were always changed. Like instead of Douglas Hagmann or Joe Hagmann, you would have Masonic names. It could be Siegfried and Roy. It could be anything. But they would give you different names, and they would give you a number, and that's the way you would be known. So that they under that cloak of secrecy, the Catholic clerics could work with the mafia and work with members of the Christian Democratic Party to stage these acts of terror. And once again, we're talking about acts of terror that went on for 12 to 13 years. Major bombings, in which women, children, old people were just blown away, killed, blown to smithereens. So,
wow.
Oh yeah, and you see, the CIA wanted that because the CIA was very much afraid of the Italians coming into power in Italy, because in Italy there were more communists in Italy than in any place. I'm going back to when this really came about in 1970. There were more Italians there were more communists in Italy than there were in the Soviet Union. Card-carrying communists. This sounds unbelievable, but it's true. The communists would have come to power. But how would you stop the communists from coming to power? Well, what they did was, once again, beginning with Piazza Fontana, what they did was they staged this terrible bombing in which hundreds of people were killed. And they sent in their own investigators, and they said, oh, these are the Red Brigades. The communists are doing this. the communists are killing you. And and then an attack would be accompanied by another attack and another attack, all more and more and more horrific. And this went on and on until the Bologna bombing. And once again, week after week, that's why they call them the years of lead, because so many people were killed with bullets and and shrapnel. But once again, the CIA was heavily involved in that, and the mafia. The mafia, especially through the Italian street gangs, could stage these violent undertakings. Even the kidnapping and the assassination of the Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro was conducted by propaganda due under the Catholic cardinals and under the CIA. All of that. But once again, the objective there was for the Christian Democrats to remain in power, not only because the United States was concerned about the communists taking over, but Italy is one of the most strategic locations for American military bases. And all that would be done away with by the communists coming to power. And the Catholic Church at that time, of course, became invested in everything, in every major industry, every major undertaking throughout Italy. If the communists came to power, they would have been taxed. So, I mean, they had to find these things were of incredible importance to America and to the church, and of course to the mafia, because the mafia, if were concerned that they were laundering all their drug money, all the heroin money for the Vatican Bank.
Mr. Williams, we're up against our break. When we come back, I want to get into this a little bit more, specifically the parts about the American intelligence agencies, like the CIA. Were they using the Vatican as assets in their war against communism that you kind of just laid out a little bit there? And then even take a little bit more look at the Masonic connections into the church and a few other things. I would like to get to the chapter, The Mark of the Antichrist, if we have times. Our guest is Paul L. Williams. He's the book of Among the Ruins, which we have right here. Folks, go to Amazon, search the book out, buy it. It's a great book. We'll be right back with Mr. Williams after this break.
Dr. Paul L. Williams is our guest, a prolific author among the books Operation Gladio. You know him from that, his Coast appearance about Operation Gladio, and now Among the Ruins, where he documents the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. I consider him one of the great intellectual minds of our time, and I really do, and I mean that sincerely. And I'm not just saying that. For him to really put together his latest work, Among the Ruins, to me, having been raised a Catholic and understanding, witnessing that time period when women went to the Catholic Church, when women went to church wearing dresses and head covering, and men wore suits, where children were seated in pews in the front. And I remember the clicker. Believe me, any of this hitting home with any of our listeners, I'll bet you it is. But and of course, where it is today and how it's come, and this documents really the decline and fall, sadly, of that institution. And I say sadly because, well, obviously anything that strikes at the heart of of Christianity or Christianity is just something to really, it should give you cause to pause. And I know there are going to be people saying, well, it's really not, it's not a Christian organization. Look, that's not the issue here. The issue is the documentation by Dr. Williams, and we're going to be getting more into that. And we're so glad to have him for so glad that his gift of time is incredible. Before we get to Dr. Williams, I want to ask the business owners, if you own a business, are you hiring? And if you are hiring, do you know the best place to post your job to find the best candidates? Well, we do. And we've used ZipRecruiter.com, and we've used it with great effectiveness. It's a challenge today to find great talent. and it's important to find the right talent for the right job. With ZipRecruiter, you can post your job to 100 plus job sites with just one click. Then their powerful technology efficiently matches the right people to your job better than anyone else. That's why ZipRecruiter is different. Unlike other job sites, ZipRecruiter doesn't depend on candidates finding you, it finds them. In fact, 80%, listen to that, 80% of employers who post a job on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site within 1 day. No juggling of emails, no calls to your office. Simply screen, rate, and manage candidates all in one place with ZipRecruiter's easy-to-use dashboard. Find out today why ZipRecruiter has been used by businesses of all sizes to find the most qualified job candidates with immediate results. And now, you, the listener of the Hagmann Report, can post jobs on ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, free. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/Hagmann. That's ZipRecruiter.com/Hagmann. One more time to try for free. Go to ZipRecruiter.com/Hagmann. Back to our guest, Dr. Paul Williams. Joe, I know that you were...
we were getting into some very interesting discussions about the Masonic connections and the Jesuits. And as well, Paul, I'd like to get into the chapter of your book, The Mark of Antichrist. But I don't know, did we leave any areas untouched on the propaganda? How do you say that again? Due?
Propaganda due. Well, one thing that we did leave untouched, Joe, that we should say, like people say, oh, is the Catholic Church, if anyone would ever say this, is it or was it a Christian institution? People have to realize that every Protestant, whether they want to believe it or not, is truly have their roots in Catholicism. The dogma of the Trinity, for instance, is not included in the Bible. That's a Catholic dogma, Catholic doctrine, came about because of the Catholic Church. So you could, if you're worshiping a triune God, you are participating in Catholicism, because Catholicism is radically different than Judaism in that respect. And another thing, the Catholic Church, say what you want, the Catholic Church gave us the scriptures. Going back to the 2nd century AD, there were dozens of gospels circulating throughout the Greco-Roman world. The Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of St. John, the Gospel of St. Thomas. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of gospels. The reason that we have the canon of Scripture that is shared by all Christians is because of the Catholic Church. So, like it or not, the Catholic Church has really defined Christianity throughout the world. So people might think, oh, well, I am totally anti-Catholic. No, you're not. You still have your roots in Catholicism.
And that's a good point. I think people get confused by, and especially if you're a Catholic listening to this, I think there are Catholics that sometimes, well, you're picking on Catholics. No, you're exposing the rot in the Vatican.
And I'll give an example. As a Presbyterian, I was raised as a Catholic and a Presbyterian, went to Catholic school, and decided to go to Presbyterian church as an adult. And just before or just after I got married, the Presbyterian church as a whole voted in homosexual marriage and homosexual marriage as a clergy. So I left the church and I began to call out that decision that they made and did so publicly. And I think that's the equivalent of what we're dealing with here when we see a Christian institution founded on a very defined set of principles. When they begin to go against those principles that God had ordained and laid out and start teaching doctrines of men, then we're getting into, if it's not God who's doing this, then it's Satan. And I think people need to call out, what this is doing to the religion of Christianity and what is created today as not only as in the church, but in society as well. And today we're seeing a time like no other where society seems to be shaping and influencing the church more so than the church influencing society.
Right. And Joe, you got to realize that what the Catholic Church gave away. It gave away not only its cherished doctrines and dogmas, but an aesthetic was formed within Catholicism. Uh, the Latin Mass, like that, influenced everybody. Bach, Mozart, Verdi, even Leonard Bernstein. It influenced everybody. I mean, it was beautiful. The liturgy was beautiful, but they sacrificed all that. I mean, for what? And they had this the theology that developed during the course of the Middle Ages, that there was a unification of really reason and faith, fides and ratio. Uh, I mean, it was a magnificent achievement, crystallized by St. Thomas Aquinas. But another thing about the Catholic Church, talking about it, it was it was an institution that safeguarded Western civilization. I mean, people could say what they want about Catholicism historically, but you wouldn't have the work that the Catholic monks, by keeping the manuscripts, dutifully working as scribes throughout the Middle Ages, kept all the treasures of antiquity, and they went out and they brought when to a barbarian world, they brought civilization. I mean, the Catholic achievement was an incredible achievement, and yet, right now it's all been tossed aside for the sake of aggiornamento, of updating, of becoming more presentable to modern man. Whereas the strength of the church was always opposing the present evil age, opposing the zeitgeist, opposing the trend. But the church at Vatican II decided, no, 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 we want to be modern. We don't want people to think that we're out of step. So Latin went, the vernacular rite came in. Guitars were being played in Gothic cathedrals where the music actually clashed with the architecture, and it became a discerning and really a horrendous experience for a lot of people.
Yeah, and we see today, the anger that is there against the Catholic Church by both Christians and agnostics, and as you said, this allowing the church to become more fashionable in the eyes of the world, almost to become more appealing, has really backfired on the church. And
Vatican II was, in your book you talk about Vatican II. That was that to you, that was the modern day turning point of the Catholic Church, right?
Oh, absolutely, Doug. You got to realize that, once again, I said this in the beginning. Before Vatican II, at 1965, even when it came to an end, you got 76% of the Catholics going to Mass every week, participating in the sacraments. The Catholic Church was never, never, never more relevant, never growing to such an extent as it had been prior to 1965, the Tridentine years. And yet, at that very time, when the church was thriving everywhere, vocationally with priests and nuns and brothers, educationally with parochial schools, in every sense that where the church was thriving, at that very moment, that's when they decided they had to change things. It was suicidal.
Understood.
And you see the results right now. Every place now, the church is in retreat. You got less than 24% of Catholics in America going to church at all. And in America, it's better than it is in the rest of the world. For instance, in England, less than 8% of the people, Catholics, ever go to Mass, ever. You go into France, it's even less. The cathedrals there, the old Gothic cathedrals, are museums.
That was one thing, if I can ask this, because when I was reading the book, we see an overall decline in morality and spirituality across the globe, across the planet. Would you say that decline is much sharper with Roman Catholicism or Catholicism? And does it match? Does the decline in mass attendance or attendance to church match the overall statistical thing that we're seeing, or is it sharper than that?
Will Herberg wrote a book that was probably one of the greatest books of the 20th century. he was my mentor when I was in graduate school. It's called Protestant Catholic Jew. And Will Herberg discovered that during the 1950s, Americans identify themselves by their religion. If you ask them who they were, they'd say, "I'm a Protestant, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Jew." If you couldn't state one of these categories, you were not definable. For instance, people, if you said, I'm not a Catholic, I'm not, well, people wouldn't know where to place you in society. They'd be wondering, well, what the hell are you? Or, you must be a nobody, because that was the primary means of self-identification. And because Catholics identify themselves by their religion, there was a Catholic morality that was distinct. And primarily, you could see that in the terms of sexual ethics. But once again, when you began to erode that, Doug and Joe, when you said that, look, at the purpose of sex is always procreation, and once you had that, that's understandable. But once you start making allowances for natural birth control, for having sex when a woman can't conceive, then you start to gradually erode that, and so it starts eroding gradually, little by little by little, until the whole thing falls apart. So that right now there's no such thing as a distinct Catholic morality or a distinct Catholic way of life. It all disappeared. But in the day, I mean, people, you could identify a Catholic immediately, by their scapulars, by their medals, by their you go into their houses, the statue. They wanted to be identified as Catholics, not anymore, and they cannot be by their lifestyles. I mean, Catholics right now are even more hedonistic than Methodists. So they've lost it all. They don't, that these old teachings, like I said before, about natural law, and it's all gone. It's all gone.
Very interesting.
And it said that for a reason too, Joe. I mean, and folks think about that. It's the denial of the biological truths. I mean, how crazy is that? But Joe and I were talking, Dr. Williams, about the one chapter in there that leading to the Antichrist, essentially, or something. What was the chapter title, Joe? I now read the
Mark
book.
of Antichrist.
Right. This push toward this singularity of religions, this one world religion, where I mean, man, that's a lie that's being perpetrated by all of the hierarchy of all of the religions. It seems that we all worship the same God and we don't. But talk to us about that. How quickly we're seeing that take place.
It's all related to money. What you're seeing is what we saw, even going back, and I'm really going to be going back to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1914. What you had is you had the beginning of this concept of a new world order, of bureaucracy where all the nations could combine into one global government, one global economy, and that gave rise to the Council on Foreign Relations, as you know, Doug. Gave rise to the United Nations, gave rise to the Bilderbergers, all these groups that we all that have all become commonplace now. Well, the Catholic Church got wrapped up in that. And that's where you have this idea of a one world religion, because a one world religion goes hand in hand with a one world government. And you got to realize that there was a very close affinity between the Vatican when it went into banking and the international banking community. The Morgans, the Rothschilds, I mean, they all had the same vision, and it became in its own way contagious. And I think that's a manifestation of it in religion, where, like I said in the previous hour. Now think about this: you have a church service, a Catholic church service, and you can see it on YouTube, where you have people attending church, officiated by a priest. In the middle of it, you have an imam reading from the Quran. and saying prayers to the Quran and encouraging people to bow to the East, and they do. Then you have a rabbi going in there saying Jewish prayers. Then you have a Hindu in there reciting Hindu prayers to Hanuman and Kali, and then you have in the midst of the whole thing, you get this. I can't even stress this enough. A voodoo priest shaking bones at the congregation to bless them, and they're all bowing down. This is a religious service sponsored by the Catholic Church. This is the new one world religion, where we all worship the same gods, where all forms of religious expressions are efficacious and acceptable to Almighty God, where things like the things that make Christianity unique, like the teachings of Jesus, no one comes to the Father except through me, or the uniqueness of sacramentology, all of that is done away with. And we've seen that. We see that with Francis every day. We see that more and more and more. And it's a precedent that began when right now after Vatican II, it became spiritually beneficial for Catholics to attend non-Catholic services. You remember that, Doug? You could
Yep.
suddenly you could attend when I was a young man, and when I'm considerably older than you are, Doug. But when you were growing up, you could never go into a Protestant church. That was a mortal sin.
That's right.
That was a mortal sin. You could not go in there. And if you went in there and even sang a hymn, God help you if you went to confession, because that was partaking in a form of worship where you were turning, where you were denying the true faith, where you were committing an act of apostasy that was horrific and horrendous. You were not allowed to go into a non-Catholic church. Well, guess what? 1965, the Protestant ministers were going into the Catholic Church, addressing the congregations. And Catholics were encouraged to attend services at Presbyterian churches, Episcopal churches. You saw that. So finally, it evolved to the point where you had the voodoo priests now and the Hindus and kissing the Quran and saying that Allah is the same as the God of the Old and New Testament, which is totally erroneous.
Overturning nearly 1900 years of 1900 years
Yeah.
or whatever. Overturning all of that, and how quickly. If you look at the first, I don't know, we'll say 1500 years, just to round the numbers off, and then look at the last segment of time, the remainder of time. My goodness, the whiplash of change that you see. And you're right. I mean, you're right to point this out. You're right to document it in the book, and it's an interesting in the context in which it was written and researched like you did. Man, it's wow. Head scratching in many senses. The changes that we've seen and the rapidity, the rapid nature of the changes.
Yeah, you got to realize it all fell apart in 1965. People don't even realize the amount of power that the Catholic Church had before then. The Catholic Church could condemn a movie, and guess what? The movie would not play in communities throughout the country. It might play in 2 or 3 major cities. I remember when they condemned Baby Doll with Carol Baker. Guess what? When Catholic Church condemned that movie was not circulated. That was it. That was it. And they did the same thing with books. They had an index of books, condemned books you couldn't read. The Catholics could influence people in political office. They've lost all that. They've lost all that. It's become another secular institution. You know what? We have to talk about one before I lose you, Doug. What the Catholic Church has done in its quest for money, and this is what I hate more than anything. Since they lost income from people giving, people of the faithful, what they're doing right now is they're making billions of dollars from refugees and illegal aliens coming into the country. For every refugee coming into the country, Catholic Social Services receives almost $3,000 just to register them, not to provide service, just to register them. If the guy's coming in with 6 kids, that's 6 registers. and then they get paid for every referral that they make. So with all these clients, especially the Muslims, they're concentrating on the Muslims. The Catholics are encouraging them to come in, and they're profiting from this. They're profiting. So every bishop throughout the country that I've seen is in favor of free and unmitigated immigration, open borders. You're going to see, but it's only for profit, and they have made a bundle from this and continue to do so.
How did they do that? How did they get into that position?
That has nothing to do with religion. And the fact that the federal government gives them money out of American taxpayers, I find that the most galling of all. And we're talking now, once again, of billions of dollars, taxpayers' money going to the Catholic Social Services so they can bring in more and more. The more people that they get enrolled in welfare programs, the richer Catholic Services become.
And they justify this because of the, we'll say, lack of, I don't know, the lack of the attendance is down, the income is down, so this is a way to supplement the income.
Money and the legal fees, everything else. It's a multi. People have to look into this. It's a multi-billion-dollar business, and it affects us all because all these people come in, even the illegals. Even the illegals, Doug. Wait till you hear this. If you're an illegal, the Catholic Social Services steers you to a car dealership to buy a car, right? The government subsidizes Catholic Social Services for that referral by hundreds of dollars.
That is amazing. That and more.
Mind-boggling.
It is. And Dr. Williams, you have done, in my view anyway, you have done the Catholics and non-Catholics alike a service by writing what you've written in your book, by the documentation. And I think this is really the ultimate reference manual, ultimate reference guide of the decline and fall of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I don't say that with glee. I say that, I'm kind of angry at what I read, and I'm very upset with what I read, having been brought up. And I know a lot of people can feel the same way or feel the same way as I do. Dr. Williams, we've got about 30 seconds left, or about a minute left here. I'm going to just shut up. Minute's yours.
Okay, let me say this. This is as a writer and an investigator, somebody that is 73 years old. I work with the FBI. I've written a lot of books. I was a journalist, an investigative journalist. Listen, all of you people, the best investigator that I have ever met, who outshines me in every way, is Doug Hagmann.
Huh, thank you.
And you people to have the HAGMANN and HAGMANN report, not only watch it, but make sure you share it with your friends, that you get the word out, because Doug Hagmann has exposed more. Scales fell from my eyes after I met Doug Hagmann. So you are tuned into the right report. You're watching the right guy, and I just am delighted for the first time to speak to his son. So this was a great experience.
Yeah, it's nice, and I got to tell you, Paul, you're a great writer, and man, the stuff you come up with, what you've uncovered, is phenomenal. You and I, we're gonna have to sit down for some coffee, and I'll bring my son, and it'll be great. But thank you, brother.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Dr. Paul Williams was our guest. And Among the Ruins is his book, the latest, Operation Gladio as well. Man, what a writer. What a fantastic writer. All right, we're going to be right back. Network break. Stay with us.